11 delegations had reviewed the data. 11 delegations had declined. Registrar Colm Dre stood at the edge of the Wayfarer's Gate observation deck and looked down at the empty trial field, a vast enclosed volume of drifting wreckage and slow, tumbling debris that the coalition of the long current called, with the particular flatness of an institution that had stopped finding its own hazards remarkable, the drift. Somewhere out in that field, past 3 kilometers of dead hulls and old gravitational shear, sat a single blinking marker beacon. Reach it alone, dock with it, and hold position for 10 full minutes without support. That was the whole of the trial. It had been designed, deliberately, to answer one question. Could a species be trusted to send a single responder into a rescue, without a second ship standing by to finish the job if the first one failed? Dre had read the simulation data the same way every delegation had read it. Average survivable engagement time against the drift's shifting hazard patterns, for a lone pilot with no support craft, was 2 minutes and 40 seconds before a disabling collision. The math was not subtle. 11 delegations, each bound by a doctrine that made a single pilot's failure a permanent mark against their entire species standing in a coalition, had looked at that number and declined. Not withdrawn. Declined. The distinction mattered to the coalition's formal process, and Dre had spent that morning carefully preserving it in 11 separate files, which was professionally appropriate and also meant that as of the trial date, the field was empty and the marker beacon simply blinked, waiting, the way it had been built to wait indefinitely. He had watched each of the 11 declining delegates deliver their formal notice over the preceding 3 days, and each notice had carried its own particular flavor of regret, dressed in the careful language institutions used when they wanted a decision on record without wanting it read as fear. The Thren delegate had cited insufficient simulation confidence intervals. The Austenite delegate had cited guild liability exposure. A quiet, methodical delegate from a species Dre privately admired for its bluntness had simply written that the expected outcome did not justify the expected cost, and left it at that, without dressing the arithmetic in anything softer. 11 notices. 11 versions of the same underlying calculation, each one, in Dre's professional judgment, entirely defensible on its own terms. Then, at 0743, a junior human pilot named Mira Voss walked into the registration office and signed her name to the 12th slot. She was 24 years old. Her file listed her as a shuttle pilot from the Human Compact's Frontier Rescue Division, not a senior delegate, not a champion, not anyone the Coalition's record showed prior reason to expect. The registration carried a note describing it as a delegate request, approved that same morning by Envoy Cyril Haas, the human delegation's senior representative, with the specific weary economy of someone who has been told what a junior colleague intends to do and has already calculated that stopping her would cost more than helping her. Mira wanted, more than she had wanted almost anything in the 11 months she had spent attached to this delegation, to prove that a single human pilot could be trusted alone in the drift, because her division back home had exactly 4 rescue shuttles and no ships to spare for backup runs, and every rule the Coalition wrote requiring paired response was a rule that made her own work, out past the frontier relay stations, slower than it needed to be, in situations where slower sometimes meant someone did not make it home. She was afraid of exactly one thing, and it was not the debris field. It was the particular, familiar fear of doing everything right and still coming up short by some small, humiliating margin, the kind of near miss that people remembered longer than either a clean win or a clean loss, because it left nothing simple to say about it afterward. She had grown up with a father who flew supply runs along the same frontier corridor she now flew rescues on, and who had told her once, on one of the rare nights he talked about his work at all, that the runs he remembered clearest were never the clean ones. They were the ones where he'd been 11 minutes late, or 6 meters off course, or one relay call short of the outcome he'd wanted, because those were the ones that taught him something the clean runs never bothered to. Dre processed her registration with the composed professionalism of a man doing his job, while privately calculating that the one delegation that hadn't declined had sent someone barely out of training, alone, into a field that had a recorded history of ending far more experienced pilots in well under 3 minutes. He noted, almost as an afterthought, that her registration form listed no next of kin contact beyond a single frontier relay station call sign, the kind of detail that meant nothing on its own and everything in combination with what she was about to attempt. The drift's observation tiers filled slowly over the following hour, the way they always did before a trial, delegates arriving in loose clusters, exchanging the particular quiet conversation of people who already knew the outcome and had come mostly to see it confirmed. Adjutant Vesh Talon, a junior coalition officer assigned to Dre's office for the cycle, found his registrar at the observation rail shortly before the scheduled start and asked the question everyone in the tiers was clearly thinking. in the careful indirect phrasing junior officers used when they suspected the direct version might sound like an accusation. Has anyone briefed her on the actual hazard model? Voss asked. Not the summary. The full sheer pattern data. 11 delegations reviewed it in detail before declining. I would like to know whether she has. She requested full simulation access 3 days ago, Dre said. 6 hours of review, according to the resource room logs. Longer than any of the 11 who declined. Voss considered that for a moment. And still registered. And still registered. The trial's origin, Dre explained, without being asked, because he found he wanted to say it aloud to someone, dated back almost 40 years, to a rescue attempt that had gone wrong in exactly the way the drift's hazard field was built to test for. A single coalition responder, dispatched alone to a stranded survey vessel, had been lost when the debris field around the wreck shifted faster than her simulations had predicted, and no second ship had been close enough to reach her in time. The inquiry that followed had produced the coalition's shared consequence doctrine, a framework built on the reasonable, carefully argued premise that a species should not risk its collective standing on a single unsupported pilot's individual judgment, however skilled that pilot might be. Every species that joined the coalition afterward had inherited the same doctrine, the same caution, the same requirement that rescue operations be run in pairs, at minimum, so that no single failure could ever again be the whole of the story. The responder's name, Dre added, after a pause long enough that Voss understood he had considered leaving it out, had been logged in the founding inquiry only by rank and registration number, a detail the inquiry board had specifically chosen, in the immediate aftermath, to spare her family the particular weight of having her death become a doctrine's permanent shorthand. 40 years later, most officers administering the trial did not know her name either, and Dre suspected that was, in its own quiet way, exactly what the doctrine had been built to accomplish, a species-wide agreement to never again let one person's ending be carried alone, even in memory. It is not an unreasonable rule, Voss said. It is not, Dre agreed. It has also meant that for 40 years, no coalition rescue division has been permitted to respond faster than its slowest available paired unit, in any situation, regardless of distance or urgency. The doctrine protects against catastrophic individual failure. It does not appear, in any of our data, to have been designed with an answer for what it costs the people who are waiting on the other end of a delayed response. Voss had no answer to that, and did not offer one. He looked instead at the trial floor, where the courier shuttle sat waiting under its service gantry, small and unremarkable against the vast dark volume of the enclosed field beyond it. What happens to the marker beacon's data if she declines to launch? He asked, mostly, Dre suspected, to fill the silence rather than out of genuine uncertainty about the answer. Nothing happens to it, Dre said. It logs a 12th decline, and the field resets for the next cycle, and in 6 months we do this again with whatever delegation is willing to send someone. Do you expect that to happen? Dre considered the question longer than he expected to. I expected, an hour ago, that it already had happened, in every meaningful sense, the moment the 12th registration came through with a junior pilot's name on it rather than a senior delegate's. I no longer feel confident in that expectation. He did not elaborate further, and Voss did not press him to. A younger officer stationed further along the observation rail, overhearing the tail end of their exchange, asked whether it was ordinary for a registrar to develop this degree of personal investment in a single trial's outcome. Dre considered the question with more seriousness than its casual delivery probably warranted. It is not ordinary, he admitted. I have administered 40-some trials in my career, and this is the first one where I found myself hoping for a specific outcome before the launch signal had even gone green. I am not certain what to do with that, professionally. I suspect I will need to think about it considerably longer than the 10 minutes she has left to fly. Below them, on the trial floor, Mira Voss walked out from the delegate corridor, alone, wearing a plain flight suit with the Human Compact's Small Frontier Division insignia stitched at the shoulder, and stood at the center marker without looking up at the tiers at all. The shared consequence doctrine was, Dre had come to understand over years of administering trials under it, less a rule than a shape that 11 species had all independently grown into, each for reasons specific to their own history, and none of them wrong for having grown that way. The Thren, his own people, had adopted it after a mining catastrophe centuries earlier in which one overconfident crew chief's solo decision had cost an entire settlement its water reclamation system, a failure so total that Thren culture had never since permitted a single individual's judgment to stand unsupported in any high-consequence undertaking. The Ostenai delegation, 2 tiers over from where Dre stood, came from a species whose entire economic structure ran on collectively bonded trade guarantees, where one member's default rippled through the reputational credit of the whole guild for a generation. For the Ostanai, a single failed rescue attempt was not simply a tragedy. It was a debt the entire species would spend years repaying in trust. Mira Voss's compact, as far as Dre's briefing notes indicated, had no equivalent structure at all. Individual pilots in the Human Frontier Rescue Division were, by the Coalition's own assessment, alarmingly undersupervised, permitted to make unilateral calls in the field with what Thren doctrine would have considered reckless disregard for collective risk. And yet the Human Compact's accident rate, when Dre had pulled the comparative figures the week before, out of a curiosity he had not fully examined at the time, was not meaningfully worse than the Coalition average. It was, if anything, marginally better in exactly the category the shared consequence doctrine was built to prevent, unsupported individual failures with no one to correct course in time. A third delegation, the Corval Wayline Guild, had declined the trial for reasons closer to economics than to any formal doctrine of collective consequence. Their engagement notes, which Dre had reviewed alongside the other 10, cited a straightforward actuarial calculation. A single lost pilot cost the Guild, in training investment alone, more than the Guild's entire annual insurance allocation for frontier operations, and no rational actor, their delegate had written, risks an asset that expensive against odds this poor for a certification with no immediate operational requirement attached to it. It was not fear, exactly, that had kept the Wayline Guild's delegate in her seat that morning. It was a spreadsheet, run correctly, arriving at the only sensible conclusion available to it. He had not known what to make of that figure when he first saw it, and had set it aside as an anomaly worth revisiting later, the way one sets aside any data point that does not fit the shape one already understands. The Wayline Guild's actuarial calculation, by contrast, was a shape Dre understood perfectly, because it was, in its own way, simply a different arithmetic applied to the same underlying caution the Thren and the Ostanai expressed through doctrine rather than spreadsheets. All three approaches, he had come to think, standing at the observation rail that morning, were versions of the same fundamental posture, a settled, institutional preference for certainty over discovery, each one perfectly rational within the specific history that had produced it, and none of them, as far as his data showed, actually better at preventing loss than whatever the Human Compact was doing instead, which so far as he could tell amounted to very little formal structure at all. He mentioned it to Vesh now, mostly because the silence on the observation deck had grown long enough to want filling. Her Compact's accident rate is not meaningfully higher than ours, he said. In the specific category that doctrine exists to prevent, it is marginally better. That contradicts the doctrine's central premise, Vesh said, carefully, as though testing whether the sentence was permitted to be said aloud in this particular office. It does not contradict the premise, Dre said. The premise is that unsupported individual judgment carries more risk than supported collective judgment. I do not dispute that, in general. I am only noting that whatever her Compact does instead of what our doctrine prescribes appears, so far, to produce comparable outcomes through an entirely different mechanism, and I do not yet understand what that mechanism is. Below, on the floor, Mira ran through a short, unhurried pre-flight check on the courier shuttle assigned for the trial, her movements economical in a way that Dre recognized, distantly, as the particular competence of someone who had done this exact motion many times before, in circumstances that mattered considerably more than an audience. Vesh, watching beside him, asked the question that had clearly been building in him since the registration that morning. If she fails, does it cost her division anything? Formally, I mean. Under her own Compact structure. Dre checked the briefing file, more out of thoroughness than expectation. Her registration was filed as an individual delegate action, he said, not a Compact-level submission. If she fails, the result attaches to her personal record. Nothing in the Human Compact's own framework appears to treat it as a reflection on the division, or the Compact, as a whole. Vesh was quiet for a moment. That seems like an enormous risk for her to carry alone, with nothing shared to soften it. It does, Dre said. It also appears to be, as far as I can tell, exactly how she prefers it. Vesh found himself turning the exchange over for longer than the moment warranted, and asked, finally, the question that had been sitting underneath everything else he'd asked that morning. Do you think it is a virtue, he said, or simply an absence? Something they have chosen to build, or something they have simply never gotten around to building, the way a settlement might go generations without a proper flood wall, not because it decided against one, but because the flood never came at the right moment to demand it. Dre did not answer immediately. He watched Mira complete her pre-flight sequence below, unhurried, methodical, betraying nothing of the audience gathered above her. I don't yet know, he said. I suspect the honest answer is that it does not matter which one it is, only whether it produces an outcome we can learn something from, a virtue we can imitate, an absence we can at least understand well enough to stop mistaking for recklessness. He paused. I would like, before this cycle ends, to know which one we are looking at. I suspect she is about to tell us, whether or not that was ever her intention. Mira had not told Envoy Hass the full reason she wanted the slot, and she suspected, standing at the center marker with the drift's tumbling wreckage visible through the observation dome above her, that he had not needed her to. 3 years earlier, on her second solo run out past the Corville relay station, she had reached a drifting mining tender 40 minutes after its distress call, alone, because the compact's nearest paired unit had been 6 hours out and there had been no one closer. She had gotten the crew off with 11 minutes to spare before the tender's hull finally gave. 11 minutes was not nothing. It had also not felt, in the years since, like enough of a margin to build a policy around, and she had spent those years watching new coalition doctrine proposals arrive at her division, each one adding another layer of required backup coordination to rescue protocols that were already, in her professional opinion, too slow for the distances her division actually covered. She remembered, specifically, a briefing 8 months earlier in which a visiting coalition liaison had proposed requiring a minimum 2-ship response for any distress call beyond a certain range, a proposal built on sound reasoning and 40 years of precedent, and had watched her division's senior pilot, a woman twice her age who had been flying the frontier corridor since before Mira was born, ask the liaison a single question the room had no comfortable answer for. What do we tell the crew waiting on the other end while the second ship catches up? The liaison had not had an answer that satisfied anyone in the room, and the proposal had gone forward regardless, because it was the responsible thing to do on paper, and paper did not have to sit with anyone through the 6 hours a 2-ship requirement actually cost in practice. She had requested the simulation data for the drift trial the moment she'd learned it existed, not because she expected to win a formal argument with 6 hours of study, but because she had learned, over several years of frontier work, that the fastest way to change a rule nobody wanted to reconsider was to generate a result the rule had not accounted for. There was another memory she carried into that resource room, one she had never mentioned to Envoy Hass or to anyone else in the delegation, of a trainee named Oscar who had washed out of her own flight cohort 4 years earlier, after a single failed solo assessment during a storm that no simulation had adequately modeled. Oscar had been, by every measure that mattered, a better pilot than most of the people who passed that year, and the compact's own review board had said as much, in careful, sympathetic language, before quietly reassigning him to groundside logistics anyway, because a single dramatic failure, however unfairly weighted, had a way of following a career long after the review board's sympathy had been filed and forgotten. Mira had watched that happen and had decided, somewhere in the years since, that she would rather risk a failure that meant something than protect a clean record that meant nothing beyond its own cleanliness. She did not know, sitting in the resource room reviewing 6 hours of simulation data, that she was about to test that decision in front of 11 species who had built their entire risk doctrine around avoiding exactly the outcome Oscar had suffered. She only knew that she had already decided, a long time before that morning, which kind of pilot she intended to be. She had written to Oscar the night before the trial, a short message she almost deleted twice before sending, telling him only that she was about to attempt something that would likely remind him of the storm, and that whatever the formal result turned out to be, she wanted him to know that his washing out had never once looked, from where she stood, like the failure the review board's language had made it sound. His reply arrived 4 hours later, while she was still in the resource room, and said simply that he hoped she'd fly it the way she always flew everything, which was worse than the textbook and better than everyone assumed, and that he'd be watching the feed either way. She kept that message open on a secondary display through most of the 6 hours that followed, not because she needed the encouragement exactly, but because it was, in its own small way, a reminder of precisely what the doctrine on the other side of that field had never quite managed to build room for, a failure that had cost someone his career and had never, in her own accounting of it, cost him anything of what actually mattered. Before she left the delegate resource room that morning, she had done one more thing she had not mentioned to anyone in the human delegation, because it had not yet felt like something worth announcing. She had filed a formal review request with the Coalition's Doctrine Office, attached to her own registration, asking that the Shared Consequence Doctrine's paired response requirement be reconsidered specifically for frontier divisions operating beyond a defined response radius, regardless of what happened to her personally in the trial that followed. It was not a demand. It was, in the dry language of coalition procedure, simply a request that the matter be studied, filed by someone with no formal standing to insist on anything, attached quietly to a trial record that might, depending on the next 10 minutes, turn out to matter or might simply vanish into the archive along with 11 other declined attempts. She had not told anyone because she did not want the outcome of the trial to be read as the reason for the request. The request was true regardless of what happened next. She simply wanted it on record before anyone could decide it was only worth taking seriously if she won. The orbiter's signal light shifted from amber to green. Mira settled into the shuttle's pilot seat, ran her hand once along the edge of the console the way she always did before a run. Out of a habit she had never examined closely enough to cause superstition, and pushed forward into the drift. The first 90 seconds were, by every measure the trial's assessment systems tracked, exactly as clean as the simulation data had suggested was possible. Mira threaded the shuttle through a slow rotation of hull fragments with a discipline that matched, almost exactly, the highest performing simulation run any of the 11 declining delegations had reviewed. In the observation tier, Vesh Talon watched the live telemetry feed with an expression that had shifted, somewhere in the last minute, from professional skepticism into something closer to reluctant attention. "She is matching the top simulation trace," he said, quietly, to no one in particular. "Almost exactly." "Almost," Dre said, and found himself, for reasons he did not examine at the time, holding the word carefully, the way one holds something that might still change shape. At the 2-minute mark, Mira cleared the first major hazard cluster with 11 seconds to spare over the simulation's fastest recorded pace. At 3 minutes, past the point where every one of the 11 declined attempts would have already ended, she was still moving, adjusting for a shear pattern the drift's field had not produced in any prior simulation run, correcting for it with the specific unhurried economy of someone reading the field rather than following a memorized path through it. The correction itself, when Dre reviewed the telemetry afterward with the trial's own engineering staff, turned out to be a maneuver none of their simulation models had specifically trained for, a small lateral drift adjustment timed against the debris field's rotational period rather than against any fixed reference point. It was not a maneuver the drift's design team had anticipated a pilot discovering live, under trial conditions, without having seen the exact pattern in advance. One of the engineers, reviewing the footage later, admitted she had needed to watch it 3 times before she understood what Mira had actually done, and admitted, more quietly, that she was not certain she could have replicated it herself under the same time pressure. At 4 minutes and 11 seconds, with the marker beacon visible ahead through a thinning cluster of wreckage, closer than any prior attempt had ever gotten, Mira's sensors picked up something the trial's own systems had not flagged. A secondary signal, faint, buried in the debris field's ambient noise, on a frequency the Coalition's rescue services used for automated distress beacons rather than trial telemetry. In the tiers, one of the 11 declined delegates, an Austenai trade representative who had spent 3 days calculating exactly why this trial could not be safely attempted, leaned toward her aide and murmured something the observation deck's translation system rendered, imperfectly, as a question about whether the pace was sustainable or simply lucky so far. Her aide had no answer. Neither, at that moment, did anyone else in the tiers, because nothing in the simulation data had prepared any of them for a pilot who was still accelerating into difficulty rather than away from it. It was old. The signature suggested a beacon that had been transmitting, weekly, for longer than the current trial cycle, possibly for years, lodged somewhere in the tumbling wreckage that the drift's field was built from, wreckage that Dre's own briefing notes, when Vesh checked them afterward, confirmed had originally been salvaged from decommissioned vessels and never fully catalogued for remaining hazards, because the field's entire purpose had been to simulate danger, not to actually contain anything. That still needed rescuing. Mira had exactly 1 clean line remaining to the marker beacon, and roughly 4 minutes left on the trial clock to reach it, hold position, and complete the certification cleanly, in a run that was, at that exact moment, faster than any recorded attempt in the trial's history. She held that line for 6 full seconds, sensors weighing the strength and decay pattern of the unscheduled signal against the diminishing window on her own clock. In the specific unhurried way she read every piece of data that actually mattered to her. She was not required to investigate an unscheduled signal that had nothing to do with her own certification. Nothing in the trial's criteria asked her to. She adjusted course toward it anyway, and the clean line to the marker beacon fell away behind her. For a fraction of a second longer than the maneuver strictly required, the shuttle's telemetry showed her hand hovering over the course correction control, a hesitation so brief that the trial's automated systems did not flag it as significant, and that only became visible at all when Dre reviewed the frame-by-frame data weeks later, looking for exactly this kind of detail. It was not indecision, he concluded eventually, comparing it against her subsequent actions. It was the particular pause of someone confirming, once more, that she had weighed the cost correctly before committing to it, the same brief stillness a person might allow themselves before stepping off a ledge they had already decided, with total certainty, that they intended to cross. The observation tiers went very quiet in the specific way a crowd goes quiet when it realizes it is watching someone choose to make their own situation worse. "She is diverting," Vesh said, and there was no skepticism left in his voice at all now, only a kind of flat disbelief. "She has the fastest clean trace in the trial's history, and she is diverting from the marker beacon to chase an unscheduled signal that has nothing to do with her certification criteria." Dre did not answer immediately. He was watching the telemetry feed with the specific attention of a man recalculating something he had assumed was already settled. "The signal registers as a distress beacon," he said finally. "Old. Possibly residual from the wreckage's original salvage history. The field was never meant to contain anything live." "Then it is not her responsibility," Vesh said. "No," Dre agreed. "It is not." Around them, the observation tiers had gone through a brief ripple of confused murmuring as the shuttle's course change registered on the shared telemetry display, several delegates checking their own readouts against their neighbors, as though suspecting a data error rather than a deliberate choice. The Wayline Guild's actuarial delegate, who had declined the trial on the strength of a spreadsheet 3 days earlier, was overheard by the deck's ambient recording asking her aide, with something close to genuine bewilderment, what possible return justified the expenditure. Her aide did not have an answer, and neither, at that moment, did anyone else seated near her. Mira brought the shuttle in tight against a drifting hull section, close enough that the drift's own hazard systems flagged the maneuver as exceeding the trial's recommended proximity tolerance, a flag that carried no formal penalty, only a note in the log that no prior attempt had ever triggered, because no prior attempt had ever gotten close enough to a piece of wreckage to need one. The beacon's signal source turned out to be a sealed equipment locker, drifting loose from whatever vessel it had originally belonged to, its housing cracked just enough to leak a faint, automated distress signal that had, according to the frequency's registration data pulled afterward, been broadcasting on a low-power loop for 6 years, ever since the wreckage had been salvaged into the drift's hazard field without a full inventory check. There was no one inside it. It was not, in the end, a person waiting to be found. It was an old emergency locator beacon, the kind fitted to survival equipment lockers across a dozen species vessels, triggered years earlier by damage that had never been reported and never fully investigated, quietly transmitting into an empty field that no one had thought to check. Mira brought the shuttle to a careful station-keeping hover alongside the locker for nearly 90 seconds, running the same diagnostic sequence she would have run on any live distress call, confirming atmosphere, confirming heat signature, confirming, methodically, that there was genuinely nothing left inside worth risking further time on before she allowed herself to disengage. It was not a glamorous 90 seconds. It was the same unhurried, procedural competence she had shown threading the debris field a minute earlier, applied now to the considerably less dramatic task of ruling something out rather than finding something. In the tiers, several delegates who had been holding their breath through the diversion let it out audibly enough that the observation deck's ambient microphones picked it up, a small, collective, involuntary sound that the trial's official recording would later capture without anyone intending it to. The locker itself, once retrieved and examined properly in the days following the trial, turned out to have belonged to a decommissioned survey vessel from a species not currently party to the coalition at all, salvaged years earlier under a routine debris clearing agreement and folded into the drift's hazard field without anyone thinking to check whether its equipment lockers had been fully emptied first. It was, in its own small way, exactly the kind of gap the shared consequence doctrine claimed to guard against, an oversight with no single person to blame for it, produced instead by an institution assuming its own procedures had already caught everything worth catching. Mira did not know any of that when she diverted toward it. She had 4 minutes left on her own clock and a signal that matched every distress pattern her training had taught her to treat as someone possibly still alive, and she had made the only decision her training had ever actually prepared her to make, which was to go and find out, rather than complete the run that would have made her the first pilot in the trial's history to finish clean. By the time Mira confirmed the locker was empty of anyone living and secured the signal to stop its automated broadcast, the trial's 10-minute window had closed. The assessment system logged the result the same way it had logged every prior attempt, a formal, unambiguous mark, certification not completed within the required window. She had not reached the marker beacon. By the trial's own stated criterion, she had failed. She turned the shuttle back toward the marker anyway, arriving at it 11 seconds after her own clock expired, and held position there for a full 10 minutes regardless, out of a stubbornness that had nothing to do with the certification anymore and everything to do with finishing the thing she had set out to do, whether or not it would count. In the observation tier, the 11 declining delegations sat in a silence that had shifted, over the last several minutes, into something none of them had expected to be sitting with that morning. Every one of them had reviewed the same simulation data, had made the same rational calculation, had declined for reasons their own doctrines made entirely sound. None of their models had accounted for a pilot who would trade the fastest clean run in the trial's history for 4 unscored minutes spent confirming that an old distress signal wasn't a person who needed saving. The Austin trade representative who had murmured her earlier question to her aide was, by this point, watching the telemetry replay in full, frame by frame, with a particular intensity of someone auditing her own species' entire risk model against a single data point that refused to fit anywhere she had a category for it. Her aide asked, quietly, whether this changed anything about their delegation's own position on attempting the trial in a future cycle. She did not answer immediately, and when she did, it was only to say that she would need considerably more than one data point before recommending anything to her guild, which was, Dre thought when he later heard the exchange relayed to him, a perfectly reasonable position for an institution to hold, and also, unmistakably, the sound of a position beginning to move. The Thren observer seated 2 rows behind them, a senior officer Dre recognized from his own homeworld's defense ministry, said nothing at all through the entire replay, which Dre understood, having served under officers of exactly that temperament for most of his career, to be considerably louder than anything he might have said aloud. Dre made a note, later that evening, to request a formal meeting with him before the review sessions began in earnest, suspecting correctly that the officer's silence that morning would prove to carry more weight in the eventual outcome than any of the more talkative reactions around him. Registrar Dre found himself, for the second time that morning, consulting the certification framework for language it had never previously needed to produce. The formal result was clear enough. Mira Voss had not completed the trial within its required window. There was no ambiguity in that finding, no obscure clause waiting to reclassify it into something more flattering. What the framework had genuinely not anticipated, in 40 years of use, was a scenario in which the reason for the failure was itself logged, in full, on the trial's own telemetry record, an unscheduled diversion to investigate a live distress signal inside the supposedly inert hazard field the coalition itself had built and never fully inventoried. That was not a technicality that rescued her result. It was a discovery that made the result almost beside the point. The trial's assessment system, still running its final diagnostic pass-long after the floor had gone quiet, produced one more line of data that Dre found himself reading twice before he fully absorbed it. Total engagement time, including the diversion, 9 minutes and 49 seconds, only 11 seconds short of the full window, a margin so narrow that under almost any other circumstance he would have called it the closest attempt in the trial's history rather than the first true failure recorded against a completed run. It was, in its own quiet arithmetic, not a defeat at all, if one were willing to measure it by anything other than the single line the framework had been built to score. The formal review that followed took considerably longer than the 10 minutes Mira had spent on the trial floor. The Drift's hazard field, it emerged over the following days, had never received a complete post-salvage inventory in the 6 years since its last major expansion, a gap that the Coalition's own safety office confirmed, with evident discomfort, violated the very shared consequence doctrine the field existed to test other species against. 11 delegations had spent 3 days reviewing simulation data on a trial whose physical field contained an unlogged hazard the Coalition's own doctrine should never have permitted to go unchecked in the first place. The safety officer's preliminary report, when it circulated among the delegations, noted with careful understatement that the oversight represented exactly the kind of unsupported individual failure the doctrine had been designed to prevent, committed not by a single reckless pilot but by the institution charged with enforcing caution in the first place. The safety officer's inventory director, a meticulous officer named Farrell Osu who had held the position for 11 years without a single prior citation against his department, submitted his resignation the day after the report's findings were confirmed, along with a personal note to Dre acknowledging that the gap had existed under his direct oversight, and that no amount of institutional context changed the fact that it should have been caught years earlier. Dre, reviewing the note, found himself in the unusual position of declining to forward the resignation up the chain without further discussion, on the grounds that a system built entirely around collective consequence ought not, in his view, resolve its own failure by extracting a single individual sacrifice from the very structure meant to prevent exactly that outcome. The matter remained, for some months afterward, unresolved in a way that several officers found genuinely uncomfortable, precisely because no prior precedent existed for handling it any other way. Envoy Cyril Haas, reading the incident report in the delegate lounge, allowed himself something close to a dry, private amusement he did not share with the room. Mira had not won the trial in the sense the coalition had built it to be won. She had, in the course of failing it, exposed a compliance failure inside the very institution administering it, a discovery that no amount of clean piloting alone would ever have produced. He drafted a brief, carefully neutral note to the Human Compact Central Office, describing the outcome in the flattest terms available, and privately suspected that the flatness of the language would do more for her division's standing than any amount of enthusiasm could have. Registrar Dre requested a private meeting with her 2 days later, not to discuss her certification status, which remained, formally, incomplete, but to ask her, directly, why she had made the choice she made, given what it cost her. It didn't feel like a choice, Mira said. I had a signal that matched a distress pattern. I had time left on the clock. Checking it cost me 4 minutes I could get back next cycle. Not checking it would have cost someone everything, if there had actually been someone in there. She considered her own answer for a moment, then added, more carefully, I understand that under your doctrine, my failure was mine alone to carry. I want to be clear that I don't experience it that way. I experience it as the correct outcome of a decision I'd make again. Dre was quiet for a long moment. 11 delegations declined this trial because their doctrines hold that an individual's failure reflects on their whole species standing, he said. You failed it, by our own formal criterion, in front of all 11 of them. I find myself unable to locate, anywhere in my own reaction to that fact, anything resembling the diminishment that doctrine predicts I should feel toward your compact as a result. Then maybe the doctrine was measuring the wrong thing, Mira said, and did not say anything more, because she had already said it once, quietly, in a review request filed before she'd ever flown into the field at all. Dre studied her for a long moment before responding, turning the observation over in his mind with the same unhurried care he brought to any conclusion he did not yet fully trust himself to hold. I have administered this trial for 11 years, he said finally. In that time, I have watched a great many capable pilots decline it, for reasons their own doctrines made entirely sound, and I have never once thought to ask whether soundness and correctness were the same quality. I find that I am asking it now, largely because of 4 minutes you will likely never think about again once you are back on your own corridor. I think about them fairly often, actually, Mira said. Just not the way you'd expect. I don't replay the diversion wondering if I made the right call. I already know I did. I replay the part where I turned back toward the marker afterward, with nothing left to gain from it, because some part of me apparently still needed to finish the thing properly, even once it stopped counting for anything official. I'm still not sure what that says about me. Possibly nothing worth building a doctrine around. Possibly, Dre said. Or possibly everything worth building one around, and we simply have not yet worked out which. She did not have an answer for that, and did not offer one, and the two of them sat for a while longer in a silence that neither found it necessary to fill. The doctrine officer's review, once it began in earnest, moved slowly, the way institutional reviews built on 40 years of settled precedent generally did, and Mira did not attend most of it, because her division needed her back on the frontier long before the coalition finished arguing with itself about what her 4 unscored minutes actually meant. The review sessions themselves, according to the transcripts Dre later filed for the permanent record, were considerably less orderly than the trial that had prompted them. The Thren delegate on the review panel, a senior jurist named Halvo Wren, argued forcefully in the second session that the doctrine required no amendment at all, that the safety officer's inventory failure was a separate matter entirely from the question of whether individual pilots should be trusted alone, and that conflating the two risked dismantling 40 years of sound precedent over what amounted, in his view, to a single fortunate coincidence. A representative from the Austenai delegation countered, more carefully, that a coincidence which reliably located hazards the doctrine's own compliance structure had failed to catch was not, by any reasonable definition, simply a coincidence, and that continuing to treat it as one would itself be a failure of the same collective caution the doctrine claimed to embody. Adjutant Vesh Talon, assigned to monitor the review's early sessions, found himself, several weeks in, arguing a position he had not expected to hold, informed less by any of the formal submissions than by a single detail from the trial telemetry that he kept returning to on his own time. The locker's distress signal had been broadcasting for 6 years. In 6 years, no paired coalition response unit, operating under a doctrine specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of oversight, had ever detected it, because the doctrine's entire structure assumed that caution and thoroughness were the same thing, and had never been tested against a scenario where thoroughness meant going somewhere the plan didn't call for. The doctrine protected us from catastrophic individual failure for 40 years, Vesh said, in a session Dre attended personally. It did not, in that same 40 years, produce a single instance of someone finding what she found in 6 minutes of unscheduled attention. I am not proposing we abandon the doctrine. I am proposing that we have spent 4 decades measuring the wrong kind of risk, and calling the absence of catastrophe a form of success. Halvo Wren, unconvinced, asked Vesh directly whether he was prepared to recommend that every future trial candidate be encouraged to abandon their assigned objective whenever an unscheduled distraction presented itself, a question clearly intended to expose the position as unworkable at scale. Vesh considered it seriously before answering, in a tone that surprised even himself with how little defensiveness it carried. "No," he said. "I am recommending that we stop scoring the field as though nothing in it could ever need finding, and start asking whether our own thoroughness has kept pace with the caution we've built entire doctrines around. Those are not the same recommendation, and I would ask the panel not to treat them as though they were." Halvo Wren sat with that for a long moment, and when he spoke again, it was in a considerably quieter register than he had used through most of the session. "I flew a version of this trial myself, 41 years ago, before the doctrine existed to prevent it," he said. "I was one of 3 candidates that cycle. I was the only one who came back. I have spent every year since believing that the doctrine we built afterward was the correct answer to what happened to the other 2. I am not prepared to say, today, that it was the wrong answer. I am prepared to say, for the first time, that it may not have been the only answer available to us, and that the difference matters more than I have allowed myself to consider until this review." He did not elaborate further, and no one on the panel asked him to. The Doctrine Office did not abandon the shared consequence framework. Institutions built on 40 years of settled reasoning rarely abandoned anything quickly, and Dre had not expected them to. What emerged, after several more months of review, was a narrow amendment, permitting frontier divisions operating beyond a defined response radius to petition for individual certification pathways, provided each pilot's record, successes, and failures alike, was logged in full and made available for ongoing review, rather than folded silently into a single collective standing that no single incident could ever meaningfully separate from the whole. It was not everything Mira had asked for. It was, Dre thought, reading the final language, considerably closer to it than anyone administering the drift trial that morning would have believed possible. The amendment's final text ran to only 4 paragraphs, considerably shorter than the doctrine documents Dre was accustomed to seeing emerge from a review of this length, and he found, reading it over for the final time before it went to record, that its brevity felt less like an oversight and more like a kind of hard-won restraint. The panel had not tried to explain what Mira Voss had done, or why it had worked, or what it meant about the difference between her compact's approach and everyone else's. It had simply made room, narrowly and carefully, for the next pilot who might need it, and left the larger question exactly where Vesh had first placed it, open, unresolved, and waiting for whatever the next unscheduled signal turned out to reveal. Mira Voss returned to the Wayfarer's Gate 11 months later, for the next scheduled cycle of the trial, this time as a certified frontier pilot appearing under the new individual pathway rather than as an unlisted delegate request filed at the last hour. The observation tiers were fuller than they had been the first time. Word of the amendment had travelled through the coalition's delegations in the particular thorough way institutional gossip always did, faster than any formal notice, and several of the 11 species who had declined the original trial had sent new delegates to watch, not to attempt it themselves, not yet, but to see what the field looked like now that its inventory had been fully corrected and its doctrine quietly, narrowly rewritten around the edges of what one pilot's failure had accidentally revealed. Registrar Dre met her at the registration desk, and found himself, for reasons he did register clearly this time, glad to see her. "Clean run, this time," he said. "The field's fully inventoried. No unscheduled signals waiting for you." "I know," Mira said. "I checked." She flew the trial in 9 minutes and 51 seconds, a clean, disciplined run that matched almost exactly the pace she had set 11 months earlier, before she had traded her fastest line for 4 minutes she never regretted spending. The marker beacon logged her arrival, her hold, her certification, without incident, without diversion, without anything left over for the framework to struggle to name. There was, this time, a small crowd waiting near the delegate corridor when she stepped off the trial floor, not the 11 silent observers of her first attempt, but a mixed handful of junior officers and aides from 3 different delegations, none of whom she recognized by name, all of whom seemed to want, in the careful indirect way junior officers approach things they weren't sure they were permitted to ask about, some version of the same question. What made her decide to check the signal, the first time, when checking it so plainly cost her the clean result everyone had expected her to want more than anything? She did not have a tidy answer prepared for them, because she had never needed one at home. "I don't know how to explain it as a decision," she said finally, to the small gathered group, "because it never felt like one at the time. It felt like the only thing available to do. I think that's the part your doctrine has trouble accounting for." It isn't that we don't calculate risk. We do, all the time, badly, same as anyone. It's that somewhere along the way, we stopped needing the calculation to come out in our favor before we were willing to go look. One of the aides, from a delegation that had not yet attempted the trial itself, asked whether that made human pilots simply less careful than everyone else's. Mira considered the question seriously, the way she considered most questions people expected her to wave off. I don't think it's less careful, she said. I think it's a different place to put the caution. You put yours into making sure the plan accounts for everything before anyone moves. We put ours into making sure whoever's moving can handle whatever the plan didn't account for. Neither one is free. You just find out what each one costs at a different point in the story. The aide's delegation lead, standing a little apart from the group, asked one more question before the small crowd began to disperse, whether Mira thought her compact's approach could simply be adopted wholesale by species with very different doctrines already in place, given how well it appeared to work for her division specifically. No, Mira said, without hesitation. I don't think you take what we do and drop it into your doctrine and expect it to fit. Your doctrine grew out of something real that happened to you, the same way ours grew out of things that happened to us. I don't think the answer is copying anybody. I think it's just being willing to ask, the way your registrar apparently started asking, whether the shape you've settled into is still the shape that actually serves the people waiting at the other end of a distress call. That's not a human answer. It's just the only honest one I've got. Afterward, in the delegate corridor, Vesh Talon found her packing her flight gear and asked her, with the particular directness he had learned, over the past 11 months, not to soften around her, whether it had felt strange, flying a clean version of the same field that had cost her so much the first time. Mira considered the question for a moment before answering. The first time wasn't really about the marker beacon, she said. It never was. It was about what happens when something in the field doesn't match the plan, and whether the rule you're flying under leaves you room to notice. She shouldered her bag. This time, nothing needed noticing. That's the whole point of fixing it properly. You don't get to feel clever about it afterward. You just get a clean number on a board, and somewhere behind it, for minutes nobody has to spend twice. She left the corridor without waiting to see whether Vesh had anything to add, the way she had left the trial floor 11 months earlier, and somewhere above the drift's now fully catalogued field, the marker beacon blinked on, patient, waiting for whichever delegation came next. Registrar Comdre kept, on a shelf in his office that held almost nothing else of a personal nature, a printed copy of the original trial's full telemetry log, the one that recorded 11 declines and 1 late registration, for clean minutes and 4 unscored ones, and a distress signal that had waited 6 years to be noticed by someone who wasn't looking for it on anyone's schedule but her own. He was asked about it once, some years later, by a new registrar being trained into the role, who wanted to know why he kept a failed trial result displayed so prominently, when every other document on the shelf commemorated a success. It is a success, Dre told her. It simply is not the kind our framework was originally built to recognize. I keep it because I want to remember, every time I administer this trial, that the field in front of me might contain something my own doctrine assumed I had already accounted for. The day I stop wondering what that might be is the day I have stopped doing this job properly. The new registrar did not fully understand the answer at the time, the way Dre suspected he would not have understood it either. On the morning 11 delegations declined and a 24-year-old pilot signed her name to a slot no one expected her to fill. She would understand it eventually, he thought, the way institutions eventually came to understand most of the things that first arrived looking like a single, ordinary failure. Somewhere out past the frontier relay stations, on a corridor Mira Voss still flew twice a month, the distances remained exactly what they had always been, and the ships remained too few for the work, and none of that had changed in any way the coalition's new amendment could fully fix. What had changed, in the years since, was smaller and harder to put on a chart. A rescue that would once have waited 6 hours for a second ship now sometimes did not have to, because somewhere in an archive on a station most of its beneficiaries would never visit, a single failed trial had quietly rewritten what an institution was willing to let one person try alone. It was not the kind of change that made for a clean number on a board. It rarely is. It was simply, in the end, for minutes, spent once, that no one ever had to spend twice. Mira herself rarely spoke of the trial once she was back on the frontier corridor full-time, and when she did, it was almost never in the terms the coalition's records used for it. To her own division, it was simply the cycle she'd flown the drift, mentioned in passing the way any other run might be mentioned, wedged between complaints about relay station coffee and the usual grumbling about equipment requisitions that never arrived on schedule. The people who had flown alongside her for years did not need the story explained to them in any greater detail than that, because they had already understood, long before the coalition had, what she would do when a plan and a person's actual need for help stopped lining up. Years later, when a new frontier division was established along a still more distant corridor, staffed largely by pilots who had trained under the individual certification pathway the drift trial had eventually produced, none of them knew Mira Voss's name, or Registrar Dre's, or the specific shape of the trial that had made their own certifications possible in the first place. They simply flew their routes, alone when the distances required it, trusted by an institution that had, in the end, quietly rebuilt itself around a single stubborn decision to turn a shuttle 4 minutes off course, toward a signal that turned out, this time and every time since, to matter considerably more than the number on the clock ever did. Somewhere in the Coalition's archives, filed alongside the amendments 4 brief paragraphs, sat the original telemetry record in full, available to anyone who cared to request it, though almost no one ever did. It showed a marker beacon, blinking patiently at the far end of an empty field, and a shuttle that reached at 11 seconds late, having spent its final 4 minutes exactly where its pilot had decided, without needing anyone's permission, that they belonged.